Good evening. I wish to thank the Ωνάσειος Foundation and the curators, archivists, and the personnel of the Καβάφη Archive for inviting me here to speak as part of this esteemed series of Μαθήματα. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to speak to you about Constantine Καβάφη and art. Καβάφi's work enjoys a unique relationship with the visual arts beyond the plain fact that so many of his poems deal with sculptors, painters, and models. He was an avid appreciator of painting and sculpture who numbered many artists among his friends. What has only recently received full attention is the particular pictorial quality of Καβάφi's poems, one that drew inspiration and found an informing aesthetic in the plastic arts. The pictorial dimension of Καβάφi's aesthetic remains central to his work and continues to contribute to his global appeal and ongoing popularity. My talk today will explore the rich connections between Καβάφη and the fine arts by tracing his early exposure to Victorian artists as well as his intellectual evolution through the art-fixated Parnassian and decadent trends in French poetry and the tradition of pictorial poetics rooted in the transposition d'art salon critique and in the transpositional poems that it inspired. This genre served as the inspiration and catalyst for the art for art's sake movement, which energized and transformed poetic writing during the latter part of the 19th century. I will be drawing from my recent book, Reframing Decadence, as well as my current work in progress, the biography, and I will conclude by considering some notable examples of contemporary pictorial, sculptural, and photographic art directly inspired by Καβάφi's poems. The obvious poetic place of departure for this subject is the poem I've brought to art. I sit in a mood of reverie. I brought to art desires and sensations, things half glimpsed, faces or lines, certain indistinct memories of unfulfilled love affairs. Let me submit to art. Art knows how to shape forms of beauty, almost imperceptibly completing life, blending impressions, blending day with day. Much of the sentiment that animates this poem, a daydream of sorts, derives from the aesthetic movement to which Καβάφη was directly exposed as a youth. I'd like to take a few moments to briefly outline this historical connection, the aestheticism of the 1870s, which would give birth in turn to the arts and crafts movement, Art Nouveau, and the literary decadence of the 1890s, decisively influenced Victorian cultural tastes. The London artistic milieu undoubtedly cast its spell on the precocious Καβάφη during his stay in England. Through his relatives in the tightly knit Anglo-Greek business community, he was directly exposed to the art and personalities of numerous painters, George Watts, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones, and James McNeill Whistler, to name a few, artists of the first rank who were effecting a revolution in British painting. Καβάφi's wealthy London relations were at once patrons, collectors, models, and even artists of avant-garde aestheticism. The shrewd business alliances of the prominent Greek mercantile families, Καβάφη, Ioannidis, Cassavetti, Ralli, created an equally shrewd network of connoisseurship, which they used to penetrate the English upper middle class by showcasing their wealth through the purchase of works of art and the building of opulent estates in which to showcase them. The interaction between these ambitious Greek patrons and the artists they favored was socially complex, as numerous painters regularly frequented the Ioannidis and Καβάφη homes. Remarkably, the business savvy of these aesthetic patrons was matched by a discerning eye for good art. George Καβάφη, the poet's uncle, and Alexander Ioannidis commissioned portraits from Watts and paintings from Whistler, one of which, Harmony in Blue and Silver, we'll be looking at shortly in connection with Καβάφi's poem, The Sea of the Morning. In addition to the wealth and patronage of the Ioannidis Καβάφη clan, there is the equally significant participation of female relatives who modeled for some of the most famous and even infamous paintings of the 19th century. The cousins Maria Zambaco, Aglaia Coronó, and together with their friend Marie Spartoli, were collectively known in the pre-Raphaelite circle as the Three Graces. along with Marie's sister, Christina Spartoli, all had modeled at one time for Watts, Whistler, Rossetti, and Burne-Jones, setting an aesthetic standard for pre-Raphaelite feminine beauty. Among the most famous of numerous renowned canvases to emerge from these settings, paintings, it should be noted, that were variously exhibited at the Royal Academy, the Paris Salon, and the Grosvenor Gallery, is Burne-Jones's The Mill, which portrays all three graces. This was owned by the Ioannidis family, and I'm quite sure Kavafy had seen it in his stay in England. As well as studying painting and sculpture, these affluent women had very unconventional and often intimate relations with the artists who painted them. The most scandalous of these was that between Burne-Jones and Maria Zambaco, who was openly known to be the painter's mistress. The prominence of such flamboyant personalities in the Kavafy family history enhanced the family's already bona fide status as patron of the arts and arbiters of avant-garde taste, a status much publicized during the Grosvenor Gallery exhibitions and the Whistler-Ruskin trial. Equally impressive is the career of one of the other graces, Marie Spartoli Stillman, an accomplished painter who would chart an artistic career that broke cultural boundaries, both in terms of ethnicity and gender. Marie was a fully fledged member of the intellectual and artistic circles that radiated around the painters Rossetti and Ford Madox Brown, with whom she studied. She was well connected with Sarah and Toby Prinsep, Sarah being the sister of the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, who would later famously photograph Marie posing here as Hypatia. The Spartoli family acquired property in the Isle of Wight and was well ensconced in the family orbit of Virginia Stephen, later Woolf, Julia Margaret Cameron being the Bloomsbury author's great aunt. It is thought that the prototype for Lily Briscoe and Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse, perhaps the most important modernist text that foregrounds the rivalry between the painted image and the written word, may in fact have been Marie's stepdaughter, Lisa Stillman, an artist and friend of Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell. How curious that this intellectual network will reconfigure itself decades later when, via E.M. Forster, the literary path of Virginia and Leonard Woolf intersect with that of Kavafy during their futile first attempt to publish an English translation of his poems at the Hogarth Press. Thus, the high profile of aestheticism in the poet's own family and their extended Anglo-Greek business network inscribes Kavafy within the Victorian discourse on art and the debate about aesthetics that raged around him during his sojourn in England. And since Virginia Woolf ultimately winds up a figure in this cast of players, I would like to pay tribute to her important contribution to the art of biography. Woolf encouraged biographers to seek vivid glimpses into their subject and to isolate rare private moments of intimacy that hopefully will bring the biographical subject to life. In her essay, The New Biography, she comments on the tension between truth, with its granite-like solidity, and personality, with its rainbow-like intangibility. The aim of biography, she writes, is to weld these two into one seamless whole. In the spirit of Woolf's call to discover the personality, I'd like to offer a glimpse or two into Kavafy's second connection with the visual arts, one that comes from two rather intimate sources, his brother Aristides and his friend Periklής Anastasiadis. The idea of friendship will serve as a way into the challenge of glimpsing the intangible personality of the poet here. I'm indebted to a recent philosophical study on the subject of friendship by Alexander Nehamas titled On Friendship, where he offers the following useful overview. Quote, "When I approach you in friendship, my hope is that you will make me wish for things I could not have thought to wish for without you. We love our friends not just for what they already are, but also for what they can be, at least partly as a result of our relationship." These simple yet profound insights serve as a helpful frame of reference as we consider the artistic stimuli of Aristides and Periklής in terms of bolstering Kavafy's confidence and as a poet and art connoisseur, and enabling him to move beyond a mere dilettantism into a full intellectual engagement with aesthetic theory. He was indeed beholden to them for the poet and aesthete he remained in their eyes, and the great poet and man of letters he would become in actuality. Aristides was the first illustrator of his brother's poems, as documented in a rather understudied but fascinating text, his drawing album. Aristides was 10 years older than Constantine, but clearly supportive of his younger brother's talents, as is evident from the presence of 4 early Kavafi poems in this book that Aristides attentively illustrated. Here is an illustration of the poem Vain, Vain Love, Mateos, Mateos, Eros, an adaptation of the Scottish ballad Old Robin Grey by Lady Anne Barnard. The drawing narrates the rather sentimental subject matter of the poem, the thwarted passion of 2 star-crossed lovers. With its expensive leather cover, embossed gilt lettering, and high-quality paper, Aristides' album approximates an illuminated manuscript of sorts, where Kavafi's poems are given their first pictorial treatment, one that anticipates the lavish first edition of the poems produced by Rika and Alekos Singopoulos in 1935, which are accompanied by the decorative illustrations of Takis Kalmouchos. Although the poems in the album are far removed from Kavafi's mature work, the fact that his brother illustrated them in such a lavish manner documents the family's interest in painting and the pictorial dimension of the texts. Another stimulus and artistic influence was Periklής Anastasiadis, one of Kavafi's most intimate friends. The son of one of the wealthy first families of Alexandria, Periklής spent extended periods of leisure time in Paris and London, living for pleasure. It was a dandy and flaneur whose cultural pretensions and aesthetic proclivities come through vibrantly in the numerous letters he sends Kavafi over the years from Paris and abroad. He was also an accomplished painter and a portrait artist to whom George Savidis has attributed this sketch of Kavafi. Indeed, his was the life Kavafi would have led had not the family fortunes collapsed. Their intimacy was social, aesthetic, and literary, imbued with an affectionate buoyancy, as we can see in a letter from Periklής sent from Paris, where he writes, "My dear Kosti, your delightful pages afford me great pleasure, and I assure you when anything thrills me, my first thought is I wish Kavafi were here also. How varied my life is, from picture gallery to the theater, from the boulevard to that unique bois, everything is new, interesting, beautiful. I very often go to the Louvre to converse with the immortals. They always have something new to say." Kavafi makes an important trip to Paris and London with his brother John in May and June of 1897, when by chance Peri is back in Alexandria. Kavafi gets to play the connoisseur in this momentary role reversal and shares his impressions of the artwork he gazed at while there. What emerges from this rich cachet of letters exchanged between these 2 intimate friends is a passion for painting. Their somewhat competitive dalliance may be seen in the following passage from surviving drafts of Kavafi's Paris letter. "I paid a long visit to the Luxembourg Gallery. I saw wonderful pictures. I got drunk with artistic emotion. One picture chiefly that made a great impression on me, it has captured the Virgin and has underneath a sonnet composed by the painter, in which he says that he has dreamed of the Virgin, and as he saw her, he placed the image on his canvas. He has the finest gauze to dress her in, has smelted the most gold to adorn her, and has searched to find the fairest lilacs to place at her feet, and the picture bears out the sonnet fully. The Virgin is neither a very holy matron of Greek hagiographers and modern painters or the goddess of Catholic idolatry. She is a young girl of 18, say, or 20, very simple, very human, and very beautiful. It is quite a new departure, yet a realistic perspective, yet new in its treatment." Kavafi does not supply the name of either the painting or the artist here, although the passage calls to mind Rossetti's sonnet paintings. But later in this same letter, he shares his own tastes on the old masters. "Titian is great," he writes. "I like him better than Raphael. The Gioconda of Leonardo da Vinci is beautiful, but it is not for the uninitiated. Correggio and Veronese I admire too, but Titian is great. The surviving letters exchanged between Peri and Costi only hint at what must have been intense and extensive conversations about painting and art. Pericles may have been an amateur and poser in terms of his French cultural presumptions, but he provided Cavafy with an important direct connection with French cosmopolitan culture, its galleries, theater, music, and cafes. Cavafy, of course, will surpass his friend in terms of his own assimilation of French culture, its decadence in particular, but he remains indebted to Pericles and his brother Aristides for the confidence he needed at the turn of the century to live up to the image of himself as a poet that he saw reflected in their eyes. The next and most important stimulus that shaped Cavafy's pictorialist aesthetic was that of the French Parnassian school, which spanned roughly from 1867 to 1876, and whose poets were in reaction to the emotional extravagances of Romanticism. Highly influential for this movement was the work of Théophile Gautier, whose pre-Parnassian volume of poems, enamels, and cameos set a standard for the aesthetic quality most valued by the Parnassians, namely restraint, perfection of form, and an impersonal objectivity. The characteristic Parnassian connection forged between poetry and the plastic arts of sculpture and painting would become the defining aesthetic of this school of poetry. Indeed, the examples of Gautier and Baudelaire, both of whom published widely read salon critiques, reinvigorated the traditional rivalry between the sister arts of painting and poetry, establishing a new synthesis that would profoundly color Cavafy's poetics and enhance the pre-Raphaelite influence that he had imbibed during the 1870s and 1880s. Cavafy's evolving pictorialist poetics began to emerge during his intellectual engagement with these poets, ushering in a defining aesthetic, whereby an intensely visualized dramatic moment, quite often framed by historical or historicizing events, is expressed pictorially through verbal strokes that convey image, color, and gesture. Notwithstanding Cavafy's brief flirtation with the Romantic poets, during the last decade of the 19th century, he fell under the full spell of Parnassian and decadent writers. Pivotal in this straddling is Gautier, who is traditionally credited with coining the phrase art for art's sake and for introducing a heightened ekphrastic emphasis on painting and sculpture into poetry. More specifically, it is Gautier's art criticism which Baudelaire claimed educated a whole generation that set the standard for conflating painting, sculpture, and poetry. The syncretic mode of interreferencing painting, sculpture, and poetry derives from the transposition d'art genre, an ekphrastic description or evocation of a painting or sculpture in poetry or prose that evolved in large part from the Salon Review. This poetic strategy pervaded many aspects of aesthetic writing in both France and England. The transpositional approach to art, works sometimes directly identified in poems but just as often left unacknowledged, involves an almost alchemical translation from painting to poem. Gautier and Baudelaire emerge as leading voices of French art criticism in the mid-19th century. Their widely read Salon Reviews and exemplary transpositional poems set a new literary standard by ushering in an innovative, painterly aesthetic for aspiring poets. Many 19th century poets attempted to imbue painterly qualities into their compositions and looked to painting for both inspiration and a new invigorating aesthetic. As David Scott writes in his excellent book, Pictorialist Poetics, I'm indebted to him for this slant and for the phrase, quote, an important lesson transpositional poets learned from their study of painting was that the literary image, or even images, drawn directly from nature gained new authority when transposed into pictures. In other words, that the suggestive appeal of a literary subject was enhanced as it became transformed into a visual image. As a result, 19th century poets were motivated to try to reinstate into the literary or poetic image some of the vivid impact and visual appeal of the painted image, end quote. Like Gautier before him, Baudelaire favored the French painter Eugène Delacroix, and many of his most important aesthetic views derived from his descriptive analyses and critical evaluations of Delacroix's paintings. The theoretical connections Baudelaire makes between art, color, and melancholy in Delacroix's dramatic compositions offer an important intertext for approaching Kavafy's early work. No one, Baudelaire writes, after Shakespeare, excels as Delacroix does in molding drama and reveries into a mysterious unity. Baudelaire's commentary on Delacroix's painting The Entry of the Crusaders into Constantinople illustrates this new mode of impressionistic criticism and intense visualization of historic moments. Baudelaire writes, "What a sky and what a sea. Everything here is tumultuous and tranquil, like the aftermath of a great occasion. The city rising up behind the crusaders who have just traversed it spreads out with an impressive verisimilitude. Everywhere you look, there are those glittering, undulating flags unfolding and clacking their luminous folds in the transparent atmosphere. Everywhere you look, the crowd surges, alarmed, and there is a tumult of arms, pomp of garments, the emphatic truthfulness of gestures made in the great moments of life." This very pictorial formula and a unique molding of drama and reveries into a mysterious unity is one that Kavafy will gradually adopt as his own. We may safely assume then that Kavafy had transposition d'art poems and salon commentaries in mind when he envisioned his own pictorial poem Oedipus, which the subtitle of the poem informs us was written after reading the description of the painting Oedipus and the Sphinx by Gustave Moreau. The Sphinx has fallen on him with teeth and talons outspread and with all the furor of life. Oedipus succumbed to her first impulse. Her first appearance terrified him, such a face and such talk till then he had never imagined. But though the monster rests her two paws on Oedipus's breast, he has recovered quickly. And now he no longer fears her, for he has the solution ready and he will win. And yet he does not rejoice over this victory. His glance, full of melancholy, is not on the Sphinx. Far off he sees the narrow path that leads to Thebes and will end in Colonus. And his soul clearly forebodes that there the Sphinx will accost him again with more difficult and more baffling enigmas that have no answer. Clearly, Kavafy was following Baudelaire's precedent in his transposition, a manifold process involving numerous facets. As Elaine Salinas notes in her study, Alchemy and Amalgam, Baudelaire's salon critiques and transpositional poems entail various steps, including a description of the painting, which is in many instances purely metatextual, an interrogation, an interpretation, a rephrasing, and finally a translation. Kavafy's transposition from description to poem minimizes the descriptive aspect, focusing instead on the psychology of the scene, in particular the melancholy foreboding of Oedipus, which he felt dominates Moreau's canvas. He interrogates the painting in order to tease out the core essence of the Greek tragedy it references, producing in the process a direct yet elegant meditation on Moreau's most famous work. As we saw in the excerpt from Kavafy's letter to Pericles, the prevalent influence of French culture was further intensified when the poet traveled to Paris and London in 1897, a trip that included visits to the Paris Salon where the Greek painter Theodore Raleigh exhibited Orientalist paintings, and to the Royal Academy in London. Upon returning to Alexandria, Kavafy will complete and publish a series of poems that are highly pictorial in their formal structure and poetic idiom. In his sonnet Horace in Athens, Kavafy sets forth the most striking iconographic tableau. In the room of Leia the hetera, where elegance, wealth, a soft bed are found, a young man with jasmine in his hands is talking. Many stones adorn his fingers, and he wears an imation of white silk with red oriental embroidery. His language is Attic and pure, but a slight with but a slight accent in his pronunciation, betrays his Tiber and Latium origin. The young man confesses his love, and the Athenian girl hears him in silence, listens to Horace, her eloquent lover, and dazzled she sees new worlds of beauty in the passion of the great Italian. A sonnet most befitting the begetter of the phrase, ut pictura poesis, as is painting, so is poetry. Here Cavafy presents a scene that was popular with history painters, notably the English pre-Raphaelite artist John Collier. Collier's canvas, although painted well after Cavafy's poem, replicates the scene of the poem in a remarkable manner, serving as the picture in the poem, as it were, and illustrates how akin the poem is to a painterly rendition of the same subject. This juxtaposition of poem and painting allows us to assess some of the traditional aesthetic challenges that emerged from the age-old rivalry between the sister arts. As Wendy Steiner writes in her study, The Colors of Rhetoric, quote, just as a poem gains the immediacy of an actual object by making us think of physical objects, painting gains the lifelike property of motion by making us see bodies in action. In both cases, the arts approach each other by appropriating a crucial feature from the other that it lacks, visuality in poetry, motion in painting. Cavafy is consciously manipulating the relative aesthetic qualities of poems as speaking pictures and paintings as mute poems in his own pictorial poem. The first two sentences of the poem paint a visual scene, achieving in their direct simplicity the quality of enargia, vividness, so esteemed by the ancient Greek sophists in their art criticism. The setting is a Greek room with a soft bed. Horace holds a sprig of white and green jasmine, is wearing colorful rings, and is dressed in a white toga with ornate red embroidery. The poem then shifts its visual focus to the oral subject of the beautiful rhetoric for which Horace was famous. It attempts to convey motion through its emphasis on grandiose gesture. Horace is speaking and moving with traditional sophistical theatricality, yet readers are left to supply the missing words for themselves, depending, that is, on their erudition and familiarity with the classical text implied and signified by the poem. They are thus faced with the same hermeneutical challenges that they would encounter when viewing Collier's painting, which functions, in effect, as a mute iconographic rendition of Cavafy's poem. Cavafy's speaking picture tells us that Horace's language is Attic Greek, which he pronounces with a slight accent. Yet the poem refuses to supply its readers with a verbal sample of this speech, allowing them instead to imagine it. Then the poem shifts to the Etera, who in her recumbent splendor is dazzled while she ponders over the future oratorical achievements of her lover. She too is silent, and we are left with a juxtaposed visual image that signify a mute oration and a silent reverie. The poem could not be more pictorial in the overall aesthetic, and it exhibits the intersemiotic qualities of a transposition d'art text, except that in this case the signified remains an unidentified or a wholly imagined painting. A similar example of Cavafy's reliance on a visual image may be found in the poem The Funeral of Sarpedon, which was directly inspired by the engraving of Henry Leopold Levy's painting Sarpedon. Another poem from this period that invites a similar pictorial reading that explores the dialectical tension between a mute descriptive visuality and a narrative speaking voice is The Horses of Achilles, a companion poem to The Funeral of Sarpedon. It involves a double scenario, a visual description of Achilles' horses who stomp and mourn the dead Patroclus, and then a shift to the speaking voice of Zeus, who comments on the significance of the horses' actions. The poem Prayer, which George Savvidis believed was inspired by one of Theodore Raleigh's many paintings that featured women in various pious poses of supplication, similarly invites an overtly transpositional pictorial reading. The sea took a sailor down to her depths. His mother, unaware, goes and lights a tall candle before the Virgin Mother for his quick return and for good weather. And ever towards the wind she cocks her ear, but while she pleads and says her prayer, the icon listens, sad and solemn, knowing the son she awaits will never come. The oracular silence of the icon, which knows that the youth has died, evinces occult and miraculous theurgic properties, which reflect Kavafy's fascination with the mystical traditions of Byzantium. The poem foregrounds the sublime intersection between icon and prayer, image and word, and painting and poetry, a central facet of modern Hellenism, to which Kavafy pays humble tribute in a manner at once religious and personal. Indeed, the worshipful stance of the viewer before the painted image serves as a paradigm of the interpretative position of the reader before the poem. This aesthetic stance, or rather this transpositional positionality from which Kavafy wrote so many of his poems, invites a similar hermeneutical entreaty on the part of the reader. At this point, I'd like to cross the channel from France back to England to explore the direct influence of pre-Raphaelites on Kavafy's aesthetic. We'll set the tone by looking at some images from these artists. The Daydream by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. This painting hung prominently in the Ioannidis' home, and Kavafy would have seen it. In fact, the poem I've brought to art functions as an apt illustration of the painting's aesthetic attitude. Pan and Psyche. Here is Maria Zambaco depicted as Psyche being rescued from near drowning by Pan. She, by the way, attempted to drown herself too in one of her fits outside the house of Burne-Jones. Here again is Maria Zambaco, who posed for Galatia for Burne-Jones's series of paintings, Pygmalion and the Image, canvases that powerfully foreground the erotics of artistic inspiration. One may conjecture that Kavafy was drawn to the subject of a sculptor's relation to a statue owing to an added impetus from the Zambaco-Burne-Jones drama that formed part of his family history. Indeed, the transformation of a social scandal into painting set a beguiling example of sublimating and mediating desire through art, an alchemical dodge that Kavafy would master later in life when expressing his own passions through narrative voices of his personae. Kavafy would focus many poems on sculptures and statues, but one that comes closest to capturing the gorgeous palette of Burne-Jones with its quasi-classical style and semi-mystic mood is his Before the Statue of Endymion. I have come from Miletus to Latmos on a white chariot drawn by 4 snow-white mules, all their trappings silver. I sailed from Alexandria in a purple trireme to perform sacred rites, sacrifices and libations in honor of Endymion. And here is the statue. I now gaze in ecstasy at Endymion's famous beauty. My slaves empty baskets of jasmine and auspicious tributes revive the pleasure of ancient days. Interestingly enough, the centerpiece of the poem, Endymion's statue, is not described. Kavafy expects his erudite reader to draw on a previous knowledge, perhaps, of the subject's iconography in order to visualize the scene. An example of Kavafy's mastery of pictorialism, the poem foregrounds an ecstatic male gaze of the votary who engages in 3 separate but abbreviated acts: a land voyage in a majestic chariot, a sea voyage on a sumptuous galley, and a beatific encounter with the statue. The colorful touches of white chariots and mules, contrasted with purple sails and baskets of green and white jasmine, almost painterly details, create striking visual images in the reader's mind. This technique of thinking through color is a hallmark of pre-Raphaelite painting and poetry. The pre-Raphaelite aesthetic is fully at play here as Kavafy gives uninhibited poetic expression to the ideology of the so-called fleshly school of painting poetry with its androgynous male beauties. Although Burne-Jones's artistic presence was prominent in the Ioannidis Kavafy circle, his dreamy eloquence was not the only style poised to cast an aesthetic spell. As already noted, Kavafy's uncle owned 4 Whistler paintings, one of which, Harmony in Blue and Silver, depicts a lone figure standing before a blue sea on an amber impressionist shore. Impressions of Whistler's painting were discernibly in Kavafy's mind, I believe, when he composed the poem The Sea of the Morning. Here let me stand, that for a while I too may gaze on nature. Marvelous blue tints of a morning sea and an unclouded sky contrasting with an amber-colored shore, all luminously beautiful and grand. Here let me stand and think I see these things. I really did see them for a moment, soon after I had stopped. And not here also my fantasies, my reminiscences, the incomparable idols of delight. In Whitleresque fashion, the poem paints with thought and playfully blurs the line between imagination and reality. The speaker thinks he sees the blue and amber seascape described in the first stanza, but we know not whether he is recalling an actual moment at the seashore or the haunted memory of a vision of such a scene. Similarly, the transcendent sea image in the poem could just as well be an artistic rendering of the morning sea, since the Greek reads in dhalmata tis idonis, which connotes visions of sensual bliss or images of sensual pleasure. Much like Whistler's painting, with its dreamlike unfinished quality and dematerialized rendering of water and light, the poem's sea image ambiguously opens out into a fantasy-based reminiscence of a recollected impression. The reader is left with a highly artificial image of a man looking at the morning sea, which becomes equated with incomparable idols of delight rather than an actual seascape. The poem thus functions aesthetically as the memory of the sea recalled through impressions based on the painterly categories of pure color and luminosity. The intersection of poetic and pictorial elements could not be more pronounced. In addition to writing verses that either conveyed aesthetic principles or were direct responses to painted works of art, Kaváfy composed poems that actually foreground paintings or drawings of his own subjects. In his poem Pictured, we encounter a fatigued poet who looks to a bucolic painting for inspiration and rejuvenation. Similarly, in the poem of The Ship, we are presented with a memory of a youth who is aesthetic to the point of affliction. In a picture of the 23-year-old painted by his friend of the same age, an amateur, we encounter the portrait of a young dandy. And in the poem In an Old Book, we uncover an old hidden watercolor with a pre-Raphaelite sounding title, Presentation of Love, which vividly evokes the androgynous, enervated male figures who proved so troubling to Victorian art critics. Kaváfy will continue to employ this pictorial mode regularly throughout the rest of his career, never fully renouncing his aestheticist predilection for the fine arts and the transposition d'art tradition. This is surely one of the reasons why so many painters and photographers have been drawn to his work. I'd like to take the final few moments of my talk to explore some of these extraordinary intertextual interpretations and renderings of Kaváfy's poems. Alekos Fascianos' rendition of The City portrays a youth in profile, looking out a window at the city that will follow him. The view of the city is interestingly framed and appears more like a painting within a painting than a window, drawing attention to the claustrophobic predicament of the dissolute youth. As the poem says, as you've wasted your life here in this small corner, you've destroyed it everywhere else in the world. Fascianos' bold visualization of the city adds a self-reflexive touch by foregrounding a sense of entrapment, an inverse Flannery, as it were, whereby the city stalks the person, thus calling attention to the inability of the urban persona to break free from artifice and urbanity. A similar aesthetic attends David Hockney's abstract interpretation of the poem Alexandrian Kings, which is titled Caesarion and All His Beauty. This features the doomed prince in a highly staged moment of artificial glory. Hockney pays ironic tribute to the poem's pictorial spectacle by including the processing crowds, albeit in a highly stylized form, in the lower left of the etching. The ambiguous figure of Caesarion stands on what appears to be the head of either a soldier or a slave, and is flanked by the unmistakable face of his mother, Cleopatra. When viewed in tandem with the poem, the overall aesthetic effect is one of deliberate dissonance, a postmodern anti-classicism replete with Hockney's graffiti-like text, which functions ironically as a Greek epigram identifying the subject of the work. Hockney's interpretation of one of Kavafy's most visually stunning painterly poems offers an apt illustration of how readers are invited to discover the picture within the poem. Shifting to the medium of sculpture, the American post-abstract expressionist Cy Twombly, whose paintings incorporate scrawled lines of poetry, Seferis and Kavafy are among his favorite poets, has titled the sculptural work Thermopylae. Twombly, as many of you no doubt know, was invited to paint the huge ceiling of the Louvre's gallery of classical bronzes, which he covered with a stunning mural that includes the names of 7 Greek sculptors from the classical period emblazoned across it. His sculpture Thermopylae is not only titled after Kavafy's poem, but includes the first 2 lines of the poem carved into the base of the sculpture, a grave mound with 4 stylized tulips that call to mind broken spears. In her recent book on Twombly's work, Mary Jacobs reads the sculpture as a statement against the First Gulf War, informed by the Kavafyan irony that all fallen soldiers are betrayed to their deaths in the end. The inclusion of Kavafy's verses on the illusory notion of victory is another example of the poet's ongoing intertextual dialogue with the world of fine art. And I'll conclude my presentation with 2 examples from the world of photography that served as apt illustrations of how the picture in the poem continues to inspire and generate new readings and interpretations of Kavafy. In the tradition of art photography, Greek photographer Dimitris Yeros offers a series of portraits illustrating an anthology of Kavafy poems titled Shades of Love that involve close-up portraits of famous personalities and handsome models. Here is Yeros' The Prayer, another pictorial illustration of the poem featuring a mantilla-covered Olympia Dukakis posing as the mother of the sailor. In the highly fanciful series of staged photographs, The Adventures of Constantine Kavafy, art photographer Duane Michaels creates a series of provocative portraits, what he terms little fables of my imaginary theatrics, featuring the actor Joel Grey portraying Kavafy in various voyeuristic scenarios involving handsome young men. Here we have Michaels, the poet, sees the young poet read his verse. The immediate association of Joel Grey with his iconic role as master of ceremonies in Bob Fosse's musical Cabaret lends the entire series of photos an unmistakable and deliberate element of camp. Throughout, Kavafy is shown in various mock sentimental poses. This image photographically conflates 2 powerful poems, An Old Man and Very Seldom. The first 3 verses of An Old Man that set the mise-en-scène for the poem read as follows. At the noisy end of the cafe, he bent over the table. An old man sits alone, a newspaper in front of him. And in the miserable banality of old age, he thinks how little he enjoyed the years when he had strength, eloquence, and looks. He knows he's aged a lot. He sees it, feels it, yet it seems he was young just yesterday, so brief an interval, so very brief. The concluding stanza of Very Seldom, another poem, completes the photograph's background scene. His verse is now recited by young men. His visions come before their lively eyes, their healthy sensual minds, their shapely taut bodies stir to his perception of the beautiful. Perhaps this is as good a note as any on which to conclude this evening's discussion of Kavafy's pictorial poetics, with a stunning picture of a poet pondering his poetic legacy and framed by the visual perceptions of beauty that his verse continues to inspire. Thank you.